If you don't understand fractional reserve banking, you don't understand money. Every single day, most people are getting ripped off because they don't understand how the system works. Wall Street keeps printing trillions of dollars out of thin air, and yet if you do something like that, you will go to jail. How on earth do banks create so much money with fractional reserve banking? The only question is that if banks are allowed to create money out of thin air with fractional reserve banking, then why do banks constantly fail? If you look at the two largest crises in the history of the United States, the 1929 Depression and the 2008 financial crisis, they happened because the banks failed. But if banks can create money out of thin air, why didn't these banks print money to help themselves and not to collapse? It doesn't actually make sense. There's so many conspiracies about fractional reserve banking and how banks create money out of thin air. On one side, it is true, but on the other side, if they can create money out of thin air, why don't banks simply save themselves? In 2023, the Silicon Valley Bank failed, and yet it could create money out of thin air and save itself. The First Republic Bank, and there is a long list of banks that failed, and yet they could have printed so much money and saved themselves. So here in this video, let's understand how fractional reserve banking works and how the system is actually benefiting the top 1% and ripping off everyone else. So if you're ready, give this video a thumbs up and let's dive right into it. We first have to understand how the system works and how money gets into the system in the first place. Let's imagine for a moment that there isn't a single dollar in the entire system. Tomorrow we take all the dollars in the United States and we burn them. Let's take all the dollars in the world and burn them. How do the real first money get from the Federal Reserve into the system? So we have the US Treasury. The US Treasury is the US government. On the other side, we have the Federal Reserve, and there isn't a single dollar in the economy yet. So the US Treasury would say that we need money in order to cover our expenses. We have employees who work for the government, we have people who are the contractors who are building the bridges, the roads, and we have to pay them money. They will create a piece of paper called the Treasury bills and will sell it to the Federal Reserve. This is debt. The Federal Reserve will create the money out of thin air and will give it to the United States. Now, this money was created as a debt, so the US government has to pay this money back when they make this money from taxes, for example. Now, the people who got the money, who were paid by the government of the United States, will take it and they will either spend it on buying things or they will simply go to a commercial bank such as Chase, Citibank, or Bank of America and will deposit their money. Now, we have a bunch of banks now in the country, such as JP Morgan, who now have a lot of money in their bank accounts. They will take this money and will lend it to other people who want that money and are willing to borrow it at a certain percentage of interest rate. So if you, for example, want to get a credit card, you would go to Bank of America and get a credit card. The reason that Bank of America can loan you that money is because they got the money first from the people who deposited that money. This is how the first money is being deposited in the economy. And that is a tiny percentage of the money in the economy. That is pretty much around 5 to 10%. Most of the money is not created in this way. But we have to understand how the money is created in the first place to understand how most of the money is created. Most of the money is entered into the economy through something that we call fractional reserve banking. A lot of you probably heard about this concept. And the concept is very simple and it's very straightforward. Fractional reserve banking. So the banks keep a fraction of the money that is being deposited in the bank and they will loan everything else. And that's why we have the name fractional reserve banking. That fraction could be 5%, 7%, 8%, or it could be higher in times of crises. But to understand what is happening, we have to understand the role of the Federal Reserve in the entire system. Now, a lot of people don't understand what the Fed is, but a Federal Reserve is a bank for the banks. So, for example, you have an account in Bank of America. You can go to Bank of America, you can deposit money in your bank account. You can go to an ATM with your debit card of Bank of America and you can withdraw money from your account. Or I can send you money to your Bank of America account and you will see it. All the banks in the country in the United States have accounts in the Federal Reserve, just like you have an account in those banks. So those banks who have accounts in the Federal Reserve, they can keep their money in the Federal Reserve or they can borrow money from the Federal Reserve, just like you do with your bank account in any other bank. This is extremely important to understand in order to have a clearer idea of how fractional reserve banking works. So let's forget this for a moment and move to JP Morgan. How much money can JP Morgan potentially loan money? So on one side, you have people who will take their money and will deposit it in JP Morgan. Let's say that this is you and you have $500,000. You will take this money and you will go to JP Morgan and you will say to JP Morgan, here's my $500,000. I want 4% interest rate. And I doubt that JP Morgan will pay you 4% interest rate, but that's a story for another video. So JP Morgan will take your money. JP Morgan is not a charity organization. They don't have a place to keep your money. First of all, that money is most likely digital. It doesn't actually exist physically, but that doesn't matter for now. You'll keep your money in JP Morgan. JP Morgan is here to make money, and they are in the business of borrowing and lending money. They will take your $500,000 and they will loan it to someone else at a certain percentage of interest rate. It could be 10%, 7%, depends on the type of the loan and depends on the interest rate. So the second guy who actually got the $500,000, let's say it's a mortgage, he will take that $500,000 and he will buy a house. Somebody sold that house to the first person. Now the person who sold the house has the $500,000. This guy probably is not going to walk around with $500,000 in cash. And secondly, that transaction is most likely not being made in cash in the first place. It's a mortgage. And that means that the first bank from whom you're getting the mortgage is going to pay the second bank with a check or a bank transaction or something along those lines. So the guy who actually sold his house now has $500,000. So $500,000 moved from JP Morgan into the account of the person who sold the house. And this guy has an account in Chase Bank. So $500,000 moved from JP Morgan into the Chase account. Now, for this transaction to be possible, we have to go to the accounts of the Federal Reserve. Both of these banks are US banks. And in order to have a bank in the United States, you must have an account in the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a bank for the banks. And in order to operate in the banking industry, you must have an account in the Federal Reserve. Let's say, for the sake of example, both JP Morgan and Chase, their accounts in the Federal Reserve has $1 million. So JP Morgan has $1 million and Chase has $1 million. But JP Morgan has actually loaned $500,000 to somebody, and that money ended up in the Chase account. So Federal Reserve is going to take $500,000 out of JP Morgan's account and will credit it into the Chase's account. Now Chase has extra $500,000 and we are going to deduct $500,000 out of JP Morgan's account. Now, the real money hasn't actually changed. The exact same amount of money in the Federal Reserve stays the same. We simply moved $500,000 from JP Morgan's account into Chase account. But if you look at the real economy, the supply of money has dramatically increased. First of all, the $500,000 was deposited by the first person. So JP Morgan still has to pay this guy $500,000. But JP Morgan has also lent $500,000 to the second guy. So in total, it's already $1 million. The guy who sold his house has an extra $500,000 in his bank account. So it's not only just $1 million, but it's already $1.5 million. The Chase Bank is going to do the exact same thing. It's also in the business of borrowing money and loaning money. So Chase Bank is going to lend that money to someone else. That someone else will take that money and will deposit it in another bank, let's say Bank of America. So the exact same $500,000 have moved multiple times through the entire system and could have turned into $4 million or $5 million. Even though that if you check the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, you will see that one transaction was made. $500,000 was moved from JP Morgan into Chase account. And that's why these banks theoretically cannot keep creating money out of thin air, because they have to make sure that they have enough money in the Federal Reserve. If one bank is going to create money and that money will end up in the second bank account, then the Federal Reserve is going to debit one account and will create another account. In theory, the real money hasn't actually increased, but in practice, the supply of money has dramatically increased. And that's why we have different understandings of money. We have M1, M2, and M3. M1 refers to the physical amount of money that exists in the economy, the real cash, the real coins. Then M2 includes savings accounts and other things. Then M3 is a much broader understanding of money. And that's why the real amount of money in the economy is much larger than the supply of the physical money in the economy. And that means that the supply of money in the economy is consistently increasing day by day just because we have a system called fractional reserve banking. And that's why it's pretty much impossible to have a system with fractional reserve banking where the system is not inflationary. The system is designed inherently to be inflationary. So if you have, for example, $100,000 in your bank account and you're happy, you have $100,000, it's enough to retire. However, a couple of years passes and then you realize that you can't actually buy much with your $100,000 because the supply of money kept increasing. If you look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, you will see that it hasn't actually increased much. It might have increased slightly. Maybe the Fed created a small amount of money and added to the economy. However, most of the banks in the economy has been created by the commercial banks over and over and over. And sometimes these commercial banks don't actually need to have enough money in the Federal Reserve. They can actually borrow that money from the Federal Reserve as long as they have securities such as mortgage-backed securities or treasury bills. Sometimes they can borrow that money from other banks from their accounts in the account of the Federal Reserve, in order for these banks not to go bankrupt and have enough money when all the depositors will come back and ask for their money back. On one side, the system is safe because all of these banks theoretically can raise as much money as they need in order to pay off their depositors. On the other side, all the money that is being deposited is being lent to other people and multiple times have been created through fractional reserve banking, which means that all the money consistently is being devalued. And the point of the system is that money should not sit around. If money is being sit around and doing nothing in the bank accounts, then that money consistently loses money. With this system that we have since the creation of the Federal Reserve, money should be consistently being invested. And that's why rich people understand this basic concept, and that's why they never keep their money in bank accounts. It's normal to have some kind of an emergency fund, but overall, most of the money should be invested for it to have money. If you want a safe investment, you can go with treasury bills and mortgage-backed securities. If you want slightly higher than that, then you would go into the stock market and you can make 10%, 15%, 20%, depends on your investing skills, of course. And that's why most people, the vast majority of Americans, are not in the stock market. They're not investing their money, which is why they're getting poorer day by day. Asset prices keeps rising. And why would asset prices keep rising? Because we have created a system when the supply of money continuously keeps rising, whether you like it or not. And that's why the only way to save yourself from this system and take advantage out of it is to make sure that the money that you earn is being invested in the right assets. So if you're serious about investing, make sure to check the first link in the description of this video. If you want to know what is my investing strategy, how I invest my money, you can find that out by checking the first link in the description of this video. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.